Hey founders, if you're scaling your agency but your profit isn't necessarily scaling with you, this session is for you. Brandon Kordower, he's a fractional CFO for 9-figure agencies, and he's the founder of Aura CFO. Today, he walks us through his Aura framework, which is the same methodology that big holding companies like Omnicom and Publicis use to identify and evaluate whether agencies are healthy and scalable or whether they're a ticking time bomb. So in the next 30 minutes, you'll learn how to identify margin leaks and make hiring predictions based on your needs, as well as calculate exactly how much revenue you're leaving on the table with your current operations. So let's make profit your new obsession. Enjoy.
Well, thank you guys so much for the opportunity. Let me share my screen and you just let me know if you can see. Awesome. Okay, perfect. So title of this is Demystifying Agency Profitability, the Aura Scaling Model. And so the first thing I want you to think about is, do you have any hesitation around the accuracy of your financial statements? And the reason this is important is because everything that we're going to be talking about here is relying on accurate data. So if there's any question about the accuracy or timing of the financials you're receiving, those will affect some of these calculations and these figures. So it's definitely something you want to consider. And then the next question is, do you feel like you understand your financial statements? If not, that's okay. We're going to be talking a little bit more about what to look for and what are some of the important levers that you have within your agency to help drive profitability and growth. And I want to start with a quick story. So, there's this old saying, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. And I see this all the time in the agency space. I was just talking to an agency owner a few weeks back, and he does $5 million in top line revenue, which when you just hear $5 million in revenue, sounds like a very successful agency, right? Well, I looked a little bit deeper and he was only doing a 5% margin. So on 5 million in top line revenue, he had $250,000 in profit. And so that's the first thing that caught my mind or, looked into. And then I looked deeper and he was deeply in debt. And the reason for that is because the agency was not able to generate enough profit to reinvest back in as he was growing. And so what happened was, yeah, he grew to 5 million, but now the agency is loaded up with debt. And now basically any profit that the agency generates just goes right back to paying that debt. So he really has nothing to show for it at the end of the day. And the idea behind the presentation today is to avoid getting to that place, to make sure, am I hitting the right margins for growth? Am I hitting the right margins for healthy profitability? So just really quickly, who am I? My name is Brandon. I'm the founder of a company called Aura. We are fractional controllers and CFOs for marketing agencies. Our agency experience extends to 9 figures, and we've been through multiple 8-figure exits with some of our agency owners. So the first thing we need to talk about before we start digging into the numbers a little bit more is to just understand the concept of cash versus accrual accounting and what the differences are between the two. So with cash-based accounting, this is the simplest form of accounting. This is purely looking at your bank statement, and when money's coming in, it gets recorded as revenue, and when money leaves, it gets recorded as an expense. The big problem with this is that it can create significant timing differences in your financials. And when you're trying to understand margin, when you're trying to understand trend lines within the business, having those timing differences are going to skew the data, and we can't really rely on the information that we're looking at. And so ultimately, this creates low tangible value if you're working with a CFO or some strategic within the organization, because when you're not able to rely on accurate data and when you're not able to follow the trend lines, there's not a lot of good analysis that can come away from that. And this is why I highly encourage all agency owners, regardless of size, to really incorporate accrual-based accounting within their financials, also known as GAAP or generally accepted accounting principles. This is more complex, but this is by far the most accurate form of accounting that you can have within your agency. And the biggest reason for the benefit is that it aligns revenues and expenses in the same period of time so that you can actually see for every dollar of revenue I'm generating, well, what was my true direct cost against that? And you take away the timing differences and you drive and you see, okay, what's my gross margin? What's my net margin? And then you can see those trends month over month to see if you're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction. And as opposed to low tangible value with cash base, now all of a sudden, looking into more strategy or working with a fractional CFO now gives you that high tangible value to actually make some good business decisions, track and measure to them, and then follow performance. And ultimately, this is the language of finance. So whether you're talking to a banker or whether you're talking to an investment, and it could be a banker to get a line of credit, it could be an investment banker or M&A if you're in an exit process, they speak accrual. And the reason for that is because those timing differences get taken away, and all of a sudden you're going to convey much more professionalism in your agency's numbers. So let's do a quick example. And what I just want to show here is so for this first example, this is a cash-based client. And what we can see is that the blue line is revenue, orange is our cost of sales or cost of goods, and then gray is net income. Now, sometimes our revenue and our profits are aligned, but sometimes they're not. So if we look at September to October, well, these things aren't always necessarily aligned, right? There are situations where it's particularly noticeable between November and December, actually, where revenue is going up, but profits are going down. And that's where it's like, how can you run a business when things aren't aligned properly? Versus on accrual accounting, now all of a sudden our revenues and our expenses are aligned in the proper place. Now, what's interesting is that this example is actually the same company. This is the same company with the same data, just one is presented on cash basis and one is presented on accrual based. And you can see how on the accrual, it's much easier to see the trend lines, to see correlations, and therefore to actually do some analysis around the data and feel comfortable that the information you're looking at is accurate.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. My name is Austin Willman. I'm the founder of the Agency Owner Network. It's a peer-led community where founders come together and talk about strategies and stories that are happening in their business in real time. We bring in masterclass speakers like the one you're listening to now, and we have monthly breakdowns and teardowns of client challenges so you can get an entire board of trusted experts that can help you solve problems and deliver better services to your clients on a monthly basis. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's way deeper than anything you'd ever be able to find in a LinkedIn post or in a free lead magnet that's being sent to you, because we all know that happens way more than it used to. So if you're a scaling agency founder and you want to get around these people and have deep dive discussions on what's going on in your business, you can go to agencyowner.network/join to learn more and send in your application. Now, back to the convo.
And so now that we've touched on that, the next thing I want to talk about is mastering your gross margin. Your gross margin is one of the most important figures that you can look at in your agency. And so what is it? At a fundamental level, it's revenues, also sometimes called billings, minus your cost of goods, which is mostly going to be your direct labor cost. Now, direct labor is the time that people within your agency are working on client work and it's billable to the client. And so it's important to note the difference between unbillable work and billable work. Make sure you're just focusing on that billable work. Now, COGS can also include other things such as subscriptions, other things that are directly tied to performing the work for your clients. And so if I take revenue minus my cost of goods, I end up with a dollar figure known as gross profit. And if you take your gross profit divided by revenue, you end up with gross margin. And anytime you hear the word margin, just think percentage, and profit is dollar figure. Now, this is the most important single metric you have in your agency. I'm going to be touching on why in a second, but I just want to emphasize that this is a very important metric to be looking at every single month. And I also want to mention, make sure you're considering all of your direct costs. The reason I say that is because we talked about the, direct labor, but you also want to think about the payroll taxes associated with that labor, the benefits with that labor, the 401k, PTO. There's other costs, and you want to make sure you're factoring and accounting for all of those costs to really drive to getting an accurate gross margin. And let's talk about why it's so important to relentlessly focus on this. And so we're going to start with an example. So here's an agency that is doing $1 million in revenue with cost of goods of 400. So 1 million minus 400 gives us $600,000 in gross profit. If I take that 600,000 divided by the revenue, that gives me 60%. So this is generating a 60% gross margin. Now, what if we were able to not generate 60% gross margin, but what if we were able to generate 70% gross margin? Well, now all of a sudden, with the same amount of work, the same amount of labor within the agency, now we've achieved an efficiency gain of 33%, just going from 50 to 60%, a 33% gain in efficiency, which basically means how efficiently the team is working and the lack of need to continue to rehire, onboard, and train. But here's where it gets pretty crazy, is that this is a 56% increase in gross profit. And that gross profit, that difference is driving straight to the bottom line. So just going from 50% to 60% in your agency could have a significant impact. And it starts to get even more wild if you can go from 60 to 80%. So now you have 100% efficiency gain. The same amount of staff is now able to generate twice as much revenue for you, and you have 167% increase in gross profit, just going from 60 to 80%. Now, I know it's not as easy as just a flick of the switch to make that move, but what I do want to emphasize here is that little incremental improvements have a significant effect on the bottom line. And that's why I want to emphasize that this is the biggest lever you have in your agency to drive profitability, to drive the ability to reinvest back into the business and really continue to scale and grow. Now, let's talk about some agency specific considerations around gross margin. So the first one is, and I know this is a subject that is, not everybody likes to talk about, but time tracking is so important within the agency. And the reason for that is that going back to being able to understand when time is billable versus unbillable is important to really driving to getting accuracy around the margin. But in addition to that, it also allows you to better understand your utilization. And utilization is really important to track and measure so that we know when do we need to hire, who do we need to hire, and it no longer becomes like a gut feeling. Right now, the data is supporting who we need within the agency and who is driving profit for us and who may be problematic or, need additional mentorship or support. Now, it's not only important to time track by client, but you also want to do it by service offering, because as agencies grow and they look to turn more full service, now all of a sudden we're offering many different services to our clients. And it's important to understand, are we profitable in all of those service offerings? Because in aggregate, right, if we're just looking at the hours and the clients, it may appear that, okay, maybe we're generating a little bit of profit, but once you drill down and look at the services that we're providing our clients, you may actually be losing money providing some of those services. And you really want to understand, are we profitable doing the work that we're doing? Because if you continue to double down or offer more services and aren't looking at these things, this is where you can get margin erosion, particularly if you're starting to offer more services that aren't profitable to you. And this is where you can end up in a situation where your profit starts to evaporate. And a good way to track and measure this is when you're looking at your financial statements. For every revenue generating service that you offer as the agency, we'll have that be its own revenue line, and also for every cost for that line. So if you are a digital marketing agency offering XYZ service, make sure that same level of service is you're also capturing the cost. So if you are offering branding, okay, also have your direct branding costs. If you are offering website development, what is my cost of website development? You want to be tracking these things independently so you can watch the margin on each of those respective services to make sure that you're generating the right margin that you should be. And so let's talk a little bit more about utilization, particularly blended utilization. So I told you about gross margin being an important one. Utilization is also very important because this is going to tell us how we need to hire, who we need to hire, who we're having problems with. And so we want to be tracking and measuring these things monthly. And the formula that we want to look at for this is, okay, blended utilization rate as a percentage is equal to total staff billable hours divided by total staff hours. Now we're just looking at people that are billable or doing client work within the agency. So if there's somebody who is administrative only, we're not accounting for their time. But maybe they're 50% admin. Well, we would want to account for 20 hours a week of their time, right? We want to make sure that for anybody that's doing billable work, we are accounting for them and tracking and measuring the utilization. And as I kind of mentioned, this is going to help you determine whether you need more resources or maybe you need more out of your existing staff, right? There are benchmarks around utilization that'll kind of give you a pulse check on how the agency is performing. And these are the generalized benchmarks. If your utilization is 75 to 85%, that's a healthy, efficient, well-run agency. Typically, if you're above that number, it also means you're efficient, but it could also mean that there could be burnout. And so you just want to be careful that you're not overworking your staff to where you're starting to get turnover. Really that 75 to 85 is kind of the sweet spot. But at the same point, if you're under that, well, you're underutilizing. Now, that could be for a few reasons. That could be because you just need to generate more revenue. It could be because you have the wrong people in the wrong seats, right? This is some of the information that utilization is going to give you. And if you're not tracking that monthly, you wouldn't know. You would just be working off of a gut. And just a little tip, right? High utilization basically means higher margins without more hiring. And so that's why we want to focus on really enhancing the utilization. And if there's a service offering where our utilization is lower, well, then that maybe gives us as the agency owner the perspective of, okay, let's go try to bring on this kind of business because we have availability and capacity within that offering to provide those services without having to hire additional staff, which is kind of the key point. And so now bringing some of these things together, let's talk about the agency utilization and ratio analysis or a scaling model. And so this is something that we developed internally, but through a lot of the experience of what's happening at the holding company level. And so basically what this is these are the KPIs that the publicly traded holding companies review to assess health, not only within their own portfolio of agencies that they hold, but also when they're looking to acquire other agencies, they're looking at these same metrics as well. And our executive vice president actually he had experience at 3 different holding companies and they were all tracking and measuring to the same information. So it wasn't just that Omnicom was using this or Publicis was, no, they all are tracking to these same KPIs. And so the idea is how do we then give this information to you as the agency owners so that you can run a better run operation? And if if the numbers are correct and you're able to track and measure to these things monthly, it's going to tell you, okay, am I moving in the right direction or am I moving in the wrong direction in a pretty quick fashion? Obviously, with the caveat, numbers need to be accurate. And at the same time, if you want to exit your agency and you want to get the highest multiple possible, well, hitting these metrics, these KPIs, are going to give you the most attractive opportunity to generate the highest multiples for an exit. So real quick, let's just touch about some definitions before we get into the model itself. So the first one is net revenue. And basically, net revenue is gross revenue minus all of your pass-through expenses. And you want to back out your pass-throughs, otherwise it's going to skew some of the data, particularly, if you're doing a lot of media buying, right? If you're just relying on a revenue figure, including the pass-through income, and then a COGS figure, including the pass-through expenses, it's skewing the data. We're just going to back all that out to kind of smooth it out and get better accuracy. The next one is net operating margin. This is also known as EBIT. You may have heard of EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. But in this case, we want to look at your EBIT. And your EBIT margin is going to be your EBIT divided by your net revenue, which once again gives you a percentage. And then you've maybe hear word ratio. A ratio is just when you're comparing two or more numbers. Okay, so the golden rules. So here's the key portions of the KPIs, and then we can drill down into them a little bit more. So the idea is you want to keep your people costs at or less than 55% of net revenue, and you want to keep your operating costs at or less than 25% of net revenue. Now, 55 plus 25 is 80. That's going to generate a 20% margin for us. And that's the key here is we want to be generating a minimum of a 20% EBIT margin within our agency to then have enough working capital to reinvest back into the business. So what are these people costs, right? These are going to be everyone. These are going to be direct and indirect. So if you remember in gross margin, we were only talking about your direct expenses, but this is going to be all personnel within the agency. So this is going to be admin as well, and it's going to include payroll taxes, benefits, PTO, anything related to your people. And this is also going to include freelancers, contractors, and consultants. For me to say it, I'm going to say it again, accrual is really important here to make sure that you're accounting for the right information. An example would be payroll. Okay, if you run payroll every 2 weeks, well, you're going to have 10 months of the year where you have 2 pay periods, and you're going to have 2 months of the year where you actually have 3 pay periods of the month. If you're not accounting for that, you're now under-reporting your expenses 10 months and you're over-reporting your expenses for 2 months. So that's why accrual corrects all this and doesn't skew our data. And here's what's also very important is that you need to consider your replacement costs within the agency, because you may be looking at your data and you may say, well, I'm actually generating above a 20%. But, as we know, we're tax advantaged to underpay ourselves salary and to take more in distribution. And if we're not accounting for the fact of, okay, if I were to step out of my agency and I were to replace it with other individuals to perform the services that I'm offering, what would it cost to bring those people in? And those are the costs you want to be considering. So you're going to have to manipulate your financials a little bit, but that's going to give you the information to tell you you should be generating a 20% with you stepped outside, looking in on the agency, having it run on its own. So let's give a quick example of, in this case, agency net revenue, 150 grand. My people costs, I calculate for the month at 79.5. I divide those by each other, and that gives me 0.53 or 53%. Less than 55%, this business is moving in the right direction on their people costs. Okay, operating costs is basically everything else with the exception of interest expense. So any other expenses within the agency that you didn't calculate in people costs, well, you're going to account for here with the exception of interest or depreciation. So examples would be rent, utilities, dues, advertising costs yourself, travel, meals, etc. So once again, example, 150 grand in net revenue, 36K in operating costs. I divide those by each other. That gives me 0.24 or 24%, less than 25%. Once again, we're in the good. So if we bring them together, that gives us, this agency is generating a 23% net operating margin, and therefore it's a scalable, healthy agency. So it's the quick way to check in. It's a quick pulse check. Now, what about the U in the ORA scaling model, which is the utilization? So maybe if you add your people costs and operating costs, maybe you're getting above 80%. Well, in this case, if your people costs are above the 55%, you can actually calculate the opportunity loss. And what the opportunity loss is, what is the revenue that you could be generating within your agency if you were fully utilizing the way you would want to be? And so it's going to tell you if the team you have in place is adequate for what the needs are within the agency, and if any incremental new revenue will help eradicate that profit gap or now bring you back into alignment on what the agency should be generating from a margin perspective. So here is the calculation for this. It's a little complicated. I will have a QR code. You can access this deck. But basically, it's if you take net revenue times the benchmark, and the benchmark is where we want to be, not where we actually are, divided by the actual of where we are, and then subtract net revenue from that. That's going to give us our opportunity loss. Let's do an example, and we'll kind of go through it. So in the case of this example, the actual utilization for this agency was 70%. Our goal is to be at 80%. We know our monthly net revenue is 150, and we know our people costs are 90,000, or 60%, which is 90 divided by the 150. So following the formula, if we plug it all in, we basically end up with this number of $21,429. So this represents the amount of incremental revenue that you could add into your agency without needing to hire staff. And this is important because this will tell you, you can use this for forecasting. You can use this for management of the team and operations. It gives you a sense of how much more business can we take in and handle before we need to start looking at hiring any new people and individuals within the agency. And so in this case, if we added in the fact that we have this incremental revenue we can generate, well, now we were not doing well on our numbers, but if we account for that, now we are. So that tells us that, hey, the agency is good, it's in the right direction. We just need to bring in more of the right revenue, and that will solve the problems. And so in summary for this presentation, if you want to maximize the potential out of your agency, you really need to understand the numbers, and you need to understand them on accrual. Try to maintain a blended utilization above 75%. If you can, you're running an efficient team, you're doing what you can on that end. And then once utilization is captured, now it's the focus is how do we get more efficient? How do we grow our margin, right? How do we add more value such that our clients will pay us more? Or how do we find ways to optimize internally so that we can do things more efficiently? And so you want to keep your people cost ratio plus your operating cost ratio less than 80%. That's a well-run, scalable, and important sellable agency. And your numbers tell the story. I know a lot of agency owners, they're creatives, they're not numbers people, but don't ignore the numbers because this is how you're going to be able to scale your agency and do it in a way that doesn't add a ton of debt, gives you enough working capital and profits to do what you wish. If you decide you want to run a healthy, profitable agency and you don't need to reinvest into your growth, great. Now you have more distributable income. Or if you want to exit the agency, great. Generate more EBITDA because at the end of the day, it's your multiple is going to be driven off of that. So to get the highest valuation possible, look at your numbers, track these things, and really optimize around this. And here's a QR code. I'm also happy to email this to anyone. But yeah, that was my information. So I'm happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Amazing, Brandon. Thank you. And we will switch over to the members only portion of this. So if you're watching this on the live replay, you can always go to agencyowner.network/join and catch the replay on the inside of the community.